My friends, I want to tell you about a phrase my own doctor used with me during a routine visit shortly after I turned 71. A phrase that struck me so forcefully at the time that I wrote it down on the back of an old receipt in my car before I had even left the parking lot. She had been reviewing my exhaustion, my irritability, my difficulty sleeping, all of which I had assumed was simply the unavoidable symptoms of growing older. After ruling out any serious underlying illness, she looked at me directly and said, quite plainly, that at my age, I needed to begin protecting my energy the way a much younger man might protect his heart after a warning sign. Not casually, not as an afterthought, but as something approaching a genuine survival strategy. I remember feeling almost offended by the suggestion at first. I had spent my entire adult life believing that a good, honorable person gave generously of their time and energy to anyone who asked, without carefully rationing it as though it was some scarce, precious commodity to be hoarded selfishly. I had always associated the careful protection of one's own energy with a kind of selfishness I did not want to be accused of, especially in the years when I believed I should be giving even more generously to my family, my community, and the people who depended on me. But in the months that followed that appointment, I began paying closer attention to where my energy actually went each day, and what I discovered troubled me considerably. I was giving away enormous portions of my daily energy to obligations I did not genuinely wish to fulfill, to relationships that drained far more than they replenished, to worries about matters entirely outside my control, and to a persistent, low-grade anxiety about disappointing people whose approval, upon honest examination, mattered far less to my actual well-being than I had spent decades assuming it did. I slowly came to understand that my doctor's warning was not, in fact, a suggestion toward selfishness. It was a genuine matter of survival, both physical and emotional, at a stage of life where my body and mind simply no longer possessed the vast reserves of energy I had once taken entirely for granted throughout my younger decades. Today I want to share with you everything I learned about protecting this precious, increasingly limited resource, because I believe this single shift in how I related to my own energy has done more for my genuine peace and physical health in my 70s than almost any other change I have made. This is not a lesson about becoming withdrawn, selfish, or unavailable to the people you love. It is a lesson about finally recognizing that your energy, at this stage of life, has genuinely become as precious and as worthy of careful protection as your physical health itself, and that protecting it wisely is not selfishness at all, but simple, necessary stewardship of the years you still have remaining. The first thing I understood was that my energy after 70 was no longer an unlimited, self-renewing resource the way it had felt throughout most of my younger decades. For most of my life, I operated as though tomorrow would always bring a fresh, full reserve of energy regardless of how thoroughly I depleted today's supply. In my 70s, I finally understood that recovery took considerably longer, that overextension on one day genuinely compromised the days that followed, and that treating my energy with this same old careless assumption of infinite renewal was setting me up for exhaustion I had no reasonable way to recover from as quickly as I once had. The second thing I understood was that certain relationships in my life consistently depleted far more energy than they ever returned, and I had never before honestly tallied this imbalance. For decades, I maintained several relationships purely out of long habit or obligation, without ever pausing to notice how consistently drained I felt after nearly every interaction with these particular people. Once I began honestly tracking this pattern, I discovered several relationships that had been quietly costing me far more than they gave back, and I began, cautiously and respectfully, reducing the frequency and depth of my engagement with these particular draining dynamics. The third thing I understood was that constant exposure to distressing news and information was consuming a portion of my daily energy that I had never properly accounted for. I used to consume hours of news coverage daily, believing this reflected responsible civic engagement. In my 70s, I began noticing the specific, measurable toll this consumption took on my mood and my sleep, and I made the deliberate choice to significantly reduce my daily exposure, protecting a meaningful portion of my daily energy that had previously been silently drained by information I had little genuine power to act upon anyway. The fourth thing I understood was that saying yes automatically, without genuine consideration, was one of the largest hidden drains on my energy throughout my entire life. For decades, I accepted nearly every request and invitation extended to me, rarely pausing to honestly assess whether I had the genuine energy or desire to fulfill it. Learning to pause before answering, and to decline requests that did not genuinely align with my available energy, protected a resource I had previously given away almost entirely on autopilot. The fifth thing I understood was that unresolved conflict, even conflict I believed I had successfully set aside mentally, continued quietly draining my energy in the background far more than I had ever realized. I noticed that lingering tension with a family member or old friend, even when I was not actively thinking about the conflict, seemed to produce a persistent low-grade fatigue that only fully lifted once the conflict was either genuinely resolved or consciously, deliberately released. This taught me that emotional loose ends carry a genuine, measurable energy cost that deserves far more serious attention than I had previously given it. The sixth thing I understood was that comparing myself to others, a habit I discussed at length in an earlier reflection, was quietly consuming energy I could no longer afford to spend so carelessly. Each time I measured my circumstances against someone else's, whether their health, their finances, or their family closeness, I noticed a small but real depletion in my available energy, as though the comparison itself required a kind of ongoing internal labor. Releasing this habit, gradually and imperfectly, freed considerable energy that had previously been spent on a mental activity that produced no genuine benefit to my actual life whatsoever. The seventh thing I understood was that certain physical environments in my own home were quietly draining my energy simply through their disorder or discomfort. A cluttered desk, an uncomfortable chair I continued using out of habit, a poorly lit reading corner I nonetheless use daily. These small environmental frustrations, I discovered, produced a persistent, low-grade drain on my energy that I had never properly identified as a solvable problem rather than simply an unavoidable feature of my daily life. The eighth thing I understood was that carrying other people's emotional burdens as though they were my own responsibility to solve was consuming an enormous, largely invisible portion of my energy. For years, I absorbed my adult children's stresses and my grandchildren's struggles as though I personally needed to resolve them, carrying a weight that was never actually mine to carry in the first place. Learning to offer genuine support and care without absorbing the full emotional burden as my own personal responsibility protected a significant portion of energy that had previously been spent on problems I could offer love toward but ultimately could not solve on anyone else's behalf. The ninth thing I understood was that multitasking, which I had once considered a mark of efficiency and capability, actually cost me considerably more energy than focusing on a single task at a time. In my 70s, I noticed that attempting to manage several concerns simultaneously left me considerably more depleted than addressing them one at a time, in sequence, with genuine focus. This small shift in how I approached my daily tasks protected a surprising amount of energy that scattered, divided attention had previously been quietly consuming. The 10th thing I understood was that certain forms of worry, particularly worry about matters entirely outside my control, were consuming energy with absolutely nothing to show for the expenditure. I noticed that hours spent anxiously anticipating problems that either never materialized or that I had no genuine power to influence produced the same depleting effect as genuine, productive effort, without any of the corresponding benefit. Learning to distinguish between productive concern, which prompts useful action, and unproductive worry, which simply drains energy in a repetitive loop, allowed me to redirect considerable energy toward matters that actually mattered. The 11th thing I understood was that certain physical activities I continued out of stubborn habit, rather than genuine enjoyment or necessity, were costing me more energy than they were worth. I had continued a particular exercise routine into my 70s purely because I had always done it, despite noticing it left me more depleted than restored. Recognizing this imbalance and adjusting my physical activities toward ones that genuinely energized rather than merely exhausted me protected considerable daily energy I had been unknowingly wasting on a routine that no longer served my actual body's needs. The 12th thing I understood was that certain phone calls and conversations left me feeling considerably more depleted than others, and I had never before paid close attention to this pattern. I began noticing that conversations centered on complaint, criticism, or persistent negativity left me feeling drained for hours afterward, while conversations centered on genuine curiosity, warmth, or shared laughter left me feeling restored rather than depleted. This awareness allowed me to gently, gradually shift the balance of my conversations toward the kind that actually replenished rather than depleted my limited daily reserves. The 13th thing I understood was that perfectionism in small daily tasks was consuming energy far out of proportion to any genuine benefit it provided. I noticed I was still spending considerable energy ensuring small, largely inconsequential tasks were completed to an unnecessarily exacting standard, energy that could have been much better spent elsewhere. Allowing myself to complete these smaller tasks adequately rather than perfectly protected meaningful energy that perfectionism had been quietly consuming for decades without my full awareness. The 14th thing I understood was that unresolved decisions, even small ones, occupied a surprising amount of background mental energy while they remained undecided. I noticed that postponing even minor decisions, out of a vague hope that clarity would eventually arrive on its own, left these decisions quietly consuming energy in the background for as long as they remained unresolved. Learning to make even small decisions promptly, rather than allowing them to linger indefinitely, freed considerable mental energy that indecision had previously been silently draining. The 15th thing I understood was that certain family gatherings, despite genuine love for the people present, left me considerably more depleted afterward than the actual duration of the event seemed to justify. I began paying closer attention to which particular gatherings and settings drained me most heavily, and I discovered that large, loud, chaotic gatherings cost me considerably more energy than smaller, quieter visits with the same people. This awareness allowed me to advocate gently for smaller, quieter versions of these gatherings when possible, protecting my energy without diminishing the genuine connection and love the gatherings themselves were meant to express. The 16th thing I understood was that guilt, particularly guilt over things I could no longer change or control, was one of the most exhausting and least productive drains on my energy. I carried considerable guilt for years over past parenting decisions, old disagreements, and choices I could no longer revise in any way. Recognizing that this guilt served no genuine purpose beyond depleting my present energy, without offering any actual benefit to the people or situations it concerned, allowed me to gradually release much of this old guilt and reclaim the energy it had been consuming. The 17th thing I understood was that certain forms of technology and constant connectivity, despite their genuine benefits, were consuming energy through a persistent, low-grade demand for my attention throughout the day. I noticed that leaving notifications constantly active on my phone produced a subtle but real drain on my energy, an ongoing, low-level readiness to respond that never fully allowed my attention to settle fully into whatever I was actually doing. Adjusting these settings to check messages at designated times rather than continuously throughout the day protected considerable energy that constant availability had previously been quietly consuming. The 18th thing I understood was that maintaining a false, cheerful front during genuinely difficult periods cost me far more energy than honest expression of my actual feelings ever did. For years, I believed that appearing consistently positive and unbothered was expected of me, regardless of my actual internal state. I discovered that this constant performance of cheerfulness, when it did not match my genuine feelings, required considerable ongoing energy to maintain, energy that honest expression of my actual emotional state, even when difficult, never demanded nearly as heavily. The 19th thing I understood was that certain long-standing commitments and roles I continued fulfilling purely out of habit no longer aligned with what I genuinely had the energy to offer. I had served on a particular community committee for over 15 years, continuing purely from a sense of obligation to a role that no longer genuinely energized me the way it once had. Recognizing this and eventually stepping back, despite some initial guilt, freed considerable energy that habitual obligation had been quietly consuming for years past the point of genuine enjoyment or benefit. The 20th thing I understood was that certain physical discomforts I had simply tolerated for years, rather than actively addressing, were consuming background energy through the constant, low-grade effort of managing them. A chronically uncomfortable mattress, ill-fitting shoes I continued wearing out of habit, a persistent minor ache I had never properly investigated with my doctor. Addressing these small, previously tolerated discomforts directly freed a surprising amount of energy that had been quietly consumed by the ongoing effort of simply enduring them. The 21st thing I understood was that certain family members' crises, despite my genuine love for them, required me to set clearer limits around how much of my own energy I could sustainably offer without depleting myself entirely. During a prolonged family crisis involving a grandchild's difficulties, I initially gave without any boundary whatsoever, until I found myself entirely depleted and unable to function well in any other area of my life. Learning to offer genuine, sustained support within clearer limits, rather than unlimited availability that eventually left me unable to help anyone at all, ultimately served both my own well-being and the family member I was trying to support far better than my earlier, boundless giving ever had. The 22nd thing I understood was that certain recurring worries about my own health and mortality, when left unexamined and unaddressed, consumed considerably more energy than directly confronting these fears through practical action ever did. I noticed that vague, unexamined anxiety about my future health drained far more energy than the concrete, practical steps of completing advance directives, discussing my wishes openly with my family, and addressing specific health concerns directly with my doctor. Converting vague dread into specific, addressed action protected considerable energy that avoidance had previously been consuming. The 23rd thing I understood was that maintaining certain long-held grudges, a subject I addressed in an earlier reflection, consumed daily energy in a way that vastly outweighed whatever satisfaction the grudge itself continued to provide. Releasing several old grudges I had carried for decades freed a meaningful, measurable amount of daily energy that had been quietly consumed by the ongoing effort of maintaining resentment against people who, in most cases, were barely aware the grudge still existed. The 24th thing I understood was that my own harsh internal self-criticism was among the most exhausting drains on my daily energy, consuming resources I desperately needed for the actual demands of my life. I noticed that a particularly critical internal voice, quick to judge my own small mistakes and shortcomings, required considerable ongoing energy simply to manage and endure throughout each day. Practicing a gentler, more compassionate internal voice, treating myself with the same patience I would readily extend to a good friend, freed considerable energy that self-criticism had previously been consuming without providing any genuine benefit in return. The 25th thing I understood was that certain recurring, low-stakes decisions I faced daily, from what to prepare for dinner to which small errands to run first, were consuming far more energy than their genuine importance warranted. I noticed that eliminating unnecessary daily choices, by establishing simple routines around meals, errands, and other minor decisions, freed a meaningful amount of decision-making energy that could then be redirected toward matters that genuinely mattered more, a phenomenon I later learned researchers refer to as decision fatigue, though I discovered its practical reality myself long before I encountered the formal term. The 26th thing I understood was that certain long commutes and errands I continued running personally, out of habit or a reluctance to ask for help, were consuming energy I could no longer easily spare. For years, I insisted on personally handling every errand and appointment myself, regardless of the toll this took on my available energy for the remainder of the day. Learning to accept help from family members or hired assistants for certain draining logistical tasks, rather than insisting on independent self-sufficiency in every single instance, protected considerable energy that stubborn pride had previously been quietly consuming. The 27th thing I understood was that certain long-held opinions I continued defending in conversation, even on matters of little genuine importance to me personally, cost considerably more energy to maintain than simply allowing the conversation to move past them. I noticed myself continuing to argue certain points purely out of old habit, long after I had lost any genuine investment in the outcome of the disagreement. Releasing the need to defend every opinion I had ever held, particularly on matters that no longer genuinely mattered to me, freed considerable conversational and emotional energy that habitual defensiveness had been quietly consuming for years. The 28th thing I understood was that certain seasonal or annual obligations, maintained purely out of long tradition, no longer aligned with the energy I genuinely had available to sustain them. An elaborate holiday hosting tradition I had maintained single-handedly for over 3 decades had become, by my early 70s, a source of considerable dread rather than joy, though I continued it purely from a sense of obligation to tradition itself. Gradually simplifying or delegating portions of this tradition, rather than continuing to shoulder it entirely alone out of habit, protected significant seasonal energy that tradition, unexamined, had been quietly demanding of me well past the point of genuine enjoyment. The 29th thing I understood was that certain forms of anticipatory anxiety about upcoming events, even pleasant ones, consumed considerable energy well before the event itself ever arrived. I noticed that I often spent days anxiously anticipating even enjoyable gatherings, rehearsing potential conversations and worrying over details that ultimately mattered very little to the actual experience once the event arrived. Learning to notice this anticipatory anxiety and gently redirect my attention back to the present moment, rather than allowing it to consume energy for days in advance, protected considerable reserves that premature worry had previously been quietly draining. The 30th thing I understood was that certain repeated stories I told about my own past, particularly stories emphasizing old grievances or missed opportunities, consumed energy each time I retold them, reinforcing a version of my own history that no longer served me well. I noticed that certain familiar stories I had told for decades, about a career disappointment or a family slight, seemed to cost me a small measure of energy and mood each time I repeated them, as though the retelling itself kept the old wound freshly activated rather than allowing it to genuinely settle into the past. Choosing more deliberately which old stories I continued rehearsing, and which I allowed to finally rest, protected energy that habitual storytelling had been quietly consuming. The 31st thing I understood was that certain forms of clutter in my calendar, scheduling activities back to back without any buffer of rest between them, left me consistently more depleted than the activities themselves actually warranted. I noticed that scheduling several commitments consecutively throughout a single day, without any quiet transition time between them, produced a compounding exhaustion far greater than the same activities spread more generously across the week. Building in deliberate rest between commitments, rather than packing my calendar as tightly as I once had in my working years, protected considerable energy that poor pacing had been quietly costing me. The 32nd thing I understood was that certain long-avoided conversations, postponed indefinitely out of a fear of conflict, consumed more background energy through their prolonged avoidance than the actual difficult conversation itself ever eventually cost me. I noticed that the anticipatory dread of a conversation I knew I eventually needed to have, whether with a sibling or an old friend, drained my energy for weeks or months in the postponing, far more than the conversation itself, once finally held, ever actually required. Learning to have these difficult conversations sooner rather than continuing to postpone them protected considerable energy that avoidance itself had been quietly consuming. And the 33rd thing, the final lesson I want to leave you with today, is this: protecting your energy after 70 is not selfishness. It is the single most practical act of love you can offer to everyone who still depends on you, including yourself. For most of my life, I believed that generosity meant giving without limit, regardless of the cost to my own reserves. I finally understood, in my 70s, that a depleted, exhausted version of myself had far less genuine love, patience, and presence to offer anyone than a well-protected, sustainably energized version of myself ever could. Protecting my energy, I came to see, was never in conflict with loving the people around me. It was, in fact, the very foundation that made my continued love and presence for them genuinely possible. My friends, I want to be honest with you that learning to protect my energy in this deliberate way required me to unlearn decades of deeply held belief about what generosity and goodness actually required of me. I had to sit with real discomfort the first several times I declined an invitation I once would have automatically accepted, the first several times I stepped back from a role I had held out of pure obligation, The first several times I chose rest over another hour of activity I believed I should still be capable of sustaining without complaint. I think often of a particular afternoon, perhaps a year after that appointment with my doctor, when I found myself facing a familiar request from a longtime friend, one I would once have accepted immediately regardless of my own actual capacity that week. I paused, genuinely checked in with my own honest energy level, and for the first time in my life, declined a request purely because I recognized I did not have the genuine reserves to offer it well. I remember the small wave of guilt that followed this decision, and I remember, just as clearly, the surprising relief that arrived alongside it, a relief that told me, quite plainly, that I had finally begun practicing something my body and mind had been asking of me for years without my ever properly listening. I want to share one more reflection before we close, something that took me considerably longer to understand than any of the specific lessons I have already described. Protecting my energy did not, as I once feared, make me a smaller or less generous presence in the lives of the people I love. It made me, if anything, a considerably more reliable and genuinely present one. My grandchildren, my children, my remaining close friends, all began to notice, without my ever explaining the shift directly, that the time I did spend with them now carried a quality of genuine attention and warmth that had sometimes been missing during the years when I gave my presence away so freely and indiscriminately that very little of my actual self remained by the time I arrived at any given moment. Protecting my energy, in the end, did not diminish my love for the people around me. It simply ensured that the love I did offer arrived whole, rather than in the depleted, distracted fragments that unlimited, unexamined giving had so often left me with in earlier decades. If you are watching this today and you recognize, in your own life, the same pattern I carried for so many decades, giving without limit, saying yes automatically, tolerating drains on your energy you had never properly named or addressed, I want you to know that protecting your energy at this stage of life is not a betrayal of the generous, loving person you have always been. It is simply the wisdom that comes from finally understanding that your energy, like your physical health, deserves careful, deliberate stewardship, especially now, when the reserves available to you are genuinely more limited than they once were, and genuinely more precious for exactly that reason. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. I hope something I shared helps you begin noticing, honestly and without guilt, where your own daily energy actually goes, and gives you the permission you may not yet have given yourself to protect it far more deliberately than you have in decades past. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Guard your energy gently but firmly, the way you would guard anything else genuinely precious and increasingly limited. And trust that this protection, far from being selfish, is one of the truest gifts you can still offer to everyone who loves you, including the person you have spent your whole life quietly neglecting to protect. Until next time, this has been Eternal Flame Wisdom. Stay gentle with yourselves, stay protective of what remains precious, and remember, the energy you guard wisely today is the presence you will still have to offer tomorrow. Thank you for watching.